The stagecoach lurched to a stop with a groan of leather and wood, and Temperance Holloway gripped the edge of her seat as dust billowed through the gaps in the curtained windows. 3 weeks of travel had taught her the rhythms of this particular misery, the way her spine would compress at every rut, the metallic taste of grit between her teeth, the peculiar ache that settled behind her eyes from staring at endless miles of nothing. But this was the end of it. Finally, mercifully, the end. "Bitter Creek," the driver hollered from above, his voice rough as the landscape. "Such as it is." Temperance gathered her carpetbag with trembling fingers, checking for the 100th time that the letters were still tucked safely in the interior pocket. 3 letters, each one written in a careful, educated hand, each one promising her a life she'd almost stopped believing in. "I have built a cabin with my own hands. It is modest but sound. There is a creek that runs clear and cold not 50 yards from the door, and in spring the meadow fills with wildflowers the color of your name." She had memorized every word, had pressed the pages to her chest on nights when the stagecoach stopped at lonely way stations and the other passengers snored around her, had traced the signature with her fingertip until the ink began to fade. "Yours in hopeful anticipation, Silas Crenshaw." The door swung open and a weathered hand reached up to help her down. She took it, stepping into the harsh afternoon light of a town that barely deserved the name. Bitter Creek consisted of a single muddy street flanked by wooden buildings in various states of completion. A general store, a blacksmith, something that might have been a saloon or might have been a barn, it was difficult to tell. A church steeple rose at the far end, white paint peeling in long strips that curled like paper scrolls. "You the mail-order bride?" Temperance turned to find a woman studying her with undisguised curiosity. She was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her features, and eyes that missed nothing. Yes." Temperance straightened her shoulders, conscious suddenly of her travel-stained dress, the wisps of auburn hair escaping her bonnet, the dust that had settled into every crease of her skin. "I'm here to meet Mr. Silas Crenshaw. He was to collect me at the station." The woman's expression shifted into something Temperance couldn't quite read. Surprise, perhaps, or pity. "Silas Crenshaw," the woman repeated slowly. "You're certain that's the name?" "Quite certain." Temperance retrieved the most recent letter from her bag, unfolding it with the care one might show a holy relic. "He wrote that he would be waiting with a wagon. A blue wagon, he said, with a yellow wheel." The woman nodded, her mouth pressing into a thin line. "That's Caleb's wagon. Caleb Crenshaw." "I don't understand." "No," the woman sighed, and now there was no mistaking the pity in her gaze. "I don't suppose you would. I'm Lenora Whitfield, by the way. My husband runs the general store. You'd best come inside, Miss Holloway. Temperance Holloway." "Miss Holloway." Lenora took her arm with surprising gentleness. "There's something you need to know before you go any further." The interior of the general store smelled of coffee and leather, and the particular mustiness of goods that had traveled too far to reach too few. Lenora guided Temperance to a chair near the counter and poured her a glass of water from a ceramic pitcher. "Caleb Crenshaw left Bitter Creek 6 weeks ago," Lenora said, settling onto a stool across from her. "Took off in the middle of the night, with nothing but his horse and whatever he could carry in his saddlebags. Left behind debts, a half-finished barn, and apparently," she gestured at Temperance, "a bride he'd sent for." The water glass slipped in Temperance's grip. She caught it before it could fall, but several drops splashed onto her skirt, darkening the already stained fabric. "That's not possible." Her voice came out strange, distant, as if someone else were speaking through her. "The letters were signed by Silas Crenshaw. Caleb has a brother, Silas. He's still here up at the cabin." Lenora's eyes were kind but unflinching. "But Silas didn't write those letters, Miss Holloway. He didn't know anything about you until I mentioned it to him yesterday, when I heard the stage was bringing a woman who'd been asking about the Crenshaw place." The world tilted. Temperance gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles going white. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake. Just a cruel joke played by a man who never could resist making promises he had no intention of keeping." Lenora reached across and covered Temperance's hand with her own. "I'm sorry, child. Truly I am. But Caleb Crenshaw is gone, and he's not coming back. The letters, the careful, educated hand, yours in hopeful anticipation, all of it lies. Temperance had sold everything she owned to buy passage west, had left behind a position as a governess for a family that no longer needed her services after the children were sent away to school, had burned every bridge, severed every tie, because she had believed, foolishly, desperately believed, that somewhere at the end of this journey, a man was waiting who wanted to build a life with her. The brother, she heard herself say. Silas. He truly knew nothing of this. Silas keeps to himself, has since the war. Lenora's voice softened. He's not an easy man, Miss Holloway. But he's an honest one, which is more than can be said for Caleb. When I told him about you, he didn't say much. Just went quiet the way he does. I have nowhere to go. The words escaped before Temperance could stop them, raw and shameful. I have nothing. I spent every cent I had to get here. Lenora was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the stagecoach was already departing, the driver's whip cracking as the horses lurched into motion. The sound of it, the finality of it, settled into Temperance's chest like a stone. There's the boarding house, Lenora said carefully. Mrs. Pruitt takes in women sometimes if they can work for their keep. It's not much, but... The door opened with a creak of hinges, and both women turned. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun, and for a moment Temperance could see nothing but his silhouette, broad shoulders, a hat pulled low, a frame that seemed to fill the entire entrance. Then he stepped inside, and she saw his face. It was not a handsome face. It was too angular for that, too weathered, with a jaw that looked carved from the same stone as the mountain she'd glimpsed from the stagecoach window. His eyes were the gray of winter skies, and they held no warmth as they moved from Lenora to Temperance and back again. Mrs. Whitfield. His voice was low, rough, as if he'd forgotten how to use it. I came for supplies. Silas. Lenora rose, her manner suddenly brisk. This is Miss Temperance Holloway. She's the woman I told you about, the one your brother sent for. Those winter-gray eyes fixed on Temperance, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. He didn't speak, didn't move, just looked at her with an expression she couldn't decipher, though she thought she caught something flickering beneath the surface. Anger, perhaps, or shame. Mr. Crenshaw. She stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. Pride alone kept her voice from breaking. I understand there has been a misunderstanding. I want you to know that I expect nothing from you. This was your brother's doing, not yours, and I would never presume. You came all this way. His words cut through hers, flat and final. Expecting a husband.
Yes.
And now you've got nothing. The bluntness of it should have stung. Instead, it steadied her. Here, at least, was honesty. Brutal, unvarnished honesty. Yes, she said again. Silas Crenshaw removed his hat, running a hand through dark hair that was too long and showed threads of early gray at the temples. He looked at her for another long moment, something working behind those unreadable eyes. "The cabin's 4 miles out," he said at last. "There's a loft above the barn. It's dry and the roof doesn't leak. You can stay there until you figure out what comes next." Temperance blinked. "Mr. Crenshaw, I couldn't possibly—" "It's not charity." His jaw tightened. "My brother made you a promise. He's not here to keep it, so the debt falls to me. I'm not offering you marriage, Miss Holloway. I'm offering you a roof until you can find your own way." Lenora was watching the exchange with sharp eyes, her expression unreadable. "Silas," she began, "I'll bring the wagon around." He replaced his hat, already turning toward the door. "Be ready in 10 minutes." And then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving Temperance standing in the dusty silence of the general store with her carpet bag clutched to her chest and her future, such as it was, completely uncertain. "Well," Lenora let out a breath.
"That's more words than I've heard from Silas Crenshaw in 6 months combined."
Temperance stared at the closed door. Through the window she could see him crossing the street toward a wagon, blue, with one wheel painted a faded yellow, exactly as the letters had described. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said quietly. "What happened to him? In the war?" Lenora began straightening items on the counter that didn't need straightening. "That's not my story to tell, Miss Holloway. But I'll say this much. Silas Crenshaw came back from that war a different man than the one who left. And whatever he lost out there, he hasn't found it yet." Outside, the yellow-wheeled wagon was pulling around to the front of the store. Temperance gathered her bag, tucked the letters back inside, and stepped out into the harsh light of Bitter Creek to meet a stranger who owed her nothing, but was offering her everything she had left. She did not know, as she climbed onto the wagon seat beside him, that the letters in her bag were only half the story, or that the other half was hidden in a box beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin where she was about to make her temporary home. The wagon lurched forward, and Temperance gripped the rough wooden seat to keep from swaying into the man beside her. Silas Crenshaw handled the reins with the same economy of movement she had observed in the store. No wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish. The horses knew their way, and he let them have their heads once they cleared the edge of town. She studied him from the corner of her eye as Bitter Creek fell away behind them. He was broader through the shoulders than she had imagined from Caleb's letters, his hands larger, rougher. The letters had described a man who loved poetry, and the way morning light fell through pine branches. This man looked like he had never stopped to notice light falling through anything. "It's about 4 miles, he said without looking at her. His voice was lower than she expected, worn smooth like river stone. "Road gets rough after the creek crossing." "I don't mind rough roads." He glanced at her then, a quick assessment that took in her travel-worn dress, her dust-covered boots, her hands folded tight in her lap. Whatever conclusions he drew, he kept to himself. They rode in silence through a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, brown grass giving way to stands of pine, the mountains rising blue and distant against a sky so vast it made her chest ache. Ohio had been green and close, the horizon always interrupted by trees or hills or the smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Here there was nothing to stop the eye from traveling all the way to the edge of the world. "You came from Ohio," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "Cincinnati. My father ran a print shop until he died. After that I worked as a seamstress." "No family left?" "A cousin in Philadelphia. We exchanged letters at Christmas." She paused. "She didn't approve of my coming west." "Smart woman." The words could have been cruel, but his tone held no malice. He was simply stating a fact, the way one might observe that the sky was blue or that winter was cold. "Perhaps," Temperance said, "but she wasn't the one living in a boarding house with $17 to her name and no prospects for improvement." Silas made a sound that might have been acknowledgment. The wagon wheels creaked beneath them, and somewhere in the distance a hawk called out its hunting cry. "The letters," he said after a long pause. "What did they promise you?" Temperance felt heat rise to her cheeks. "A home, a partnership, someone who wanted—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence without her voice breaking. "Someone who wanted what?" She turned to face him fully, studying the hard line of his jaw, the way his eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. "Someone who wanted to build something, who saw marriage as more than convenience or obligation." A muscle twitched in his cheek. "Caleb always did have a way with words." "And you don't?" "I say what needs saying, nothing more." They crossed the creek he had mentioned, the water running shallow and clear over smooth stones. On the other side, the road narrowed to little more than a track, winding through thicker stands of pine that blocked out the worst of the afternoon sun. "The cabin's small," Silas said. "One room. I sleep in the loft when weather permits, but it's not fit for—" He stopped, started again. "There's a space above the barn. Caleb used it when he first came to stay with me. It's rough, but it's private. You can have it until you figure out what comes next." "And what do you expect in return?" The question hung between them like smoke. Silas pulled the horses to a stop so abruptly that Temperance had to brace herself against the seat. "I don't expect anything," he said, and for the first time she heard something like anger in his voice. "Whatever my brother promised you, whatever he made you believe, that's not who I am. You'll have a roof over your head and food to eat because no decent man would turn a woman out with nowhere to go. That's all." Temperance met his gaze without flinching. "I wasn't suggesting—" "I know what you were suggesting. And I'm telling you now, so there's no misunderstanding between us." He gathered the reins again, his knuckles white against the leather. "I'm not looking for a wife. I'm not looking for anything except to be left alone. You're welcome to stay until you can arrange passage back east or find some other situation. But don't mistake hospitality for something else." The wagon lurched forward again. Temperance felt something cold settle in her chest. Not quite disappointment, not quite relief, something in between. "I have no intention of returning east," she said quietly. "And I'm not looking for charity." "Then what are you looking for?" She considered the question carefully before answering. "Time. A chance to think, a place to stand while I figure out what comes next." Silas nodded once, shortly. "That I can offer." The cabin emerged from the trees like something that had grown there rather than been built, low and solid, its logs weathered to the color of old bone. A thin stream of smoke rose from the chimney, and Temperance realized with a start that he must have banked the fire before leaving that morning, expecting to return alone. The barn stood perhaps 50 yards from the cabin, newer than the main structure but showing the same careful construction. Beyond it, she could see a chicken coop, a small garden plot still dormant from winter, and the skeletal remains of what might have been a larger structure, foundation stones and a few charred timbers. "What happened there?" she asked, pointing. Silas's jaw tightened. "Fire. 3 years ago." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. Some questions, she was learning, had answers that cost too much to speak aloud. He helped her down from the wagon with impersonal efficiency, then led her to the barn. The interior smelled of hay and horses and the particular mustiness of a space that had been closed up too long. A ladder in the corner led up to a loft that ran the length of the building, its floor covered with loose straw and old blankets. "There's a bed frame up there," Silas said, climbing the ladder ahead of her. "Mattress needs airing, but it's sound. I'll bring fresh bedding from the cabin." Temperance followed him up, her skirts catching on the rough rungs. The loft was larger than she had expected, perhaps 15 feet by 20, with a small window at one end that looked out toward the mountains. Dust motes swirled in the fading afternoon light, and she could hear the soft sounds of the horses settling in their stalls below. "It's not much," Silas said, watching her take in the space. "It's more than I had yesterday." He made that sound again. Not quite a laugh, not quite a grunt. "I'll bring you supper when it's ready. Outhouse is behind the cabin, wells to the east. Don't go into the woods after dark. There's wolves been coming down from the high country." "Mr.
Crenshaw." He stopped at the top of the ladder, waiting. "Thank you for this, for not simply—" she searched for the right words, "for not treating me as though my misfortune were my own fault." Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. Everyone's misfortune is their own fault, one way or another. Doesn't mean they deserve to suffer for it alone. Then he was gone, climbing down the ladder with the ease of long practice, leaving her alone in the dusty silence of the barn loft. She spent the next hour making the space habitable. The mattress, when she dragged it to the window and beat it with a broken broom handle she found in the corner, released clouds of dust but proved to be stuffed with good straw, not yet moldy or vermin-infested. The bed frame was rough but sturdy, and when Silas returned with an armload of quilts and a pillow that smelled of cedar, she accepted them with a nod of thanks that required no words. He brought her supper as promised, a bowl of stew, thick with potatoes and some kind of game meat, and a heel of bread that was only slightly stale. She ate sitting on the edge of the bed, watching the last light fade from the window, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place. Somewhere below she heard Silas moving through the barn, checking on the horses, securing the door for the night. Then his footsteps crossed the yard toward the cabin, and she was alone. She unpacked her bag slowly, laying out her few possessions on the bed. 3 dresses, 2 changes of underclothes, her mother's Bible, its spine cracked from years of use, a small sewing kit, a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, their faces solemn and strange, and the letters. She held them in her hands for a long moment, feeling their weight. 3 letters, each one a lie wrapped in beautiful words. She should burn them. She should tear them to pieces and scatter them to the wind and never think of Caleb Crenshaw again. Instead, she read them. "My dear Miss Holloway," the first one began, "I hope this letter finds you well, and that you will forgive the presumption of a stranger reaching out across such distance." The words were as lovely as she remembered, full of hope and longing and the promise of a life built on shared dreams. Reading them now, knowing what she knew, she could see the craft in them, the careful construction of a man who never existed, designed to appeal to exactly the kind of woman who would answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride. Caleb Crenshaw had known precisely what she wanted to hear, and she had believed every word. When she finished reading, she tucked the letters back into her bag and lay down on the narrow bed, pulling the quilts up to her chin against the evening chill. Through the small window she could see the first stars emerging in the darkening sky, sharp and bright in a way they never were back east. Tomorrow she would begin figuring out what came next. Tonight she would allow herself this small grief, for the future she had imagined, for the man who had never been real, for the foolish hope that had carried her 3,000 miles to a stranger's barn. She was nearly asleep when she heard it, a sound from the cabin carrying clear across the still night air. A woman's name, called out in anguish. "Sarah!" Temperance sat up, her heart pounding. The sound came again, not a call but a cry, torn from somewhere deep and wounded. Then silence. She lay back down slowly, staring at the rough wooden ceiling above her head, and wondered who Sarah was, and what had happened to her that could make a man like Silas Crenshaw cry out in his sleep. The first morning, Temperance woke before dawn. She lay still in the hay-scented darkness of the barn loft, listening to the sounds of the homestead coming alive around her. A rooster's distant crow, the soft lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the walls, the creak of the cabin door, and then footsteps, heavy, purposeful, crossing the yard toward the well. She did not move until she heard him walk away toward the far pasture. Only then did she rise, shake the hay from her hair, and climb down the ladder to face whatever this new life would demand of her. By the time Silas returned from his morning chores, she had drawn water, found the wash basin he'd left on a stump outside the barn, and made herself as presentable as 3 weeks of travel and a night in a hayloft would allow. Her dress was wrinkled beyond repair. Her hair, despite her best efforts, still held traces of straw. But her spine was straight, and her chin was level when she met his eyes across the muddy yard.
"There's coffee," he said, jerking his head toward the cabin. "Biscuits from yesterday. They're hard, but they'll keep you until—" He stopped, seeming to realize he had no idea what came after until. "They'll keep you." "Thank you." He nodded once and turned away, disappearing into the barn she had just vacated. That was the shape of their first day, and their second, and their third. By the end of the first week, Temperance had mapped the boundaries of Silas Crenshaw's solitude. He rose before dawn and worked until dark. He spoke only when necessary, short sentences, practical words, nothing wasted. He took his meals alone in the cabin while she ate in the barn, an arrangement neither of them had explicitly agreed to, but both seemed to understand. He left food for her on the stump by the well each morning and evening, bread, cheese, dried meat, sometimes an apple from the small orchard behind the cabin. He never looked at her longer than he had to, never asked where she'd come from or what she'd left behind, never mentioned the name she'd heard him cry out in the darkness of that first night. Sarah. Temperance did not ask. She had her own griefs, her own names she did not speak aloud. She understood the weight of things too heavy for words. Instead, she worked. On the 4th day, she found his mending pile. It was tucked in a basket beside the cabin's back door, a collection of shirts with torn seams, trousers with frayed hems, socks worn thin at the heel.
The kind of small repairs that accumulated when a person lived alone and had no time for anything but survival. She carried the basket to the barn without asking permission. By evening, she had mended 3 shirts, darned 2 pairs of socks, and patched a tear in what looked like his only good pair of trousers. When he found the basket the next morning, returned to its spot by the door, its contents neatly folded, he stood there for a long moment, staring down at it. Temperance watched from the barn doorway, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. He looked up. Across the yard, their eyes met. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." Another long pause. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Thank you." He picked up the basket and carried it inside. When he emerged an hour later, he left a larger pile of mending on the stump, and beside it, a proper sewing kit, the kind with good scissors and strong thread and needles that hadn't been bent by clumsy hands. It was, Temperance understood, as close to an invitation as Silas Crenshaw knew how to offer. The days took on a rhythm after that. She mended his clothes, she swept the area around the barn, she fed the chickens after watching him do it twice, learning the routine without asking questions. She found the vegetable garden behind the cabin, overgrown, neglected, but not beyond saving, and began pulling weeds, her hands remembering the work from the small plot behind the orphanage where she'd grown up. He noticed. He always noticed, though he rarely spoke of it. But one morning she found a pair of gardening gloves on the stump beside her breakfast. They were too big for her hands, a woman's gloves, but a woman with larger hands than hers. She wore them anyway, and did not ask who they had belonged to. She was beginning to understand that everything on this homestead had belonged to someone else first. The gloves, the sewing kit, the cabin itself, with its curtains she glimpsed through the windows, faded calico, carefully hemmed, hung with a woman's eye for beauty in a hard place. Sarah. The name hung in the air between them, unspoken but present, a ghost neither of them acknowledged. On the 8th day, Silas spoke more than 3 sentences to her for the first time. She was in the garden, on her knees in the dirt, when his shadow fell across the row of beans she was trying to save. She looked up, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "Those won't come back," he said, gesturing at the withered plants. "Too far gone." "Perhaps." She returned to her work, gently loosening the soil around the roots. "But I've seen worse recover. It depends on whether they want to live." He was quiet for so long that she thought he'd walked away, but when she looked up again, he was still there, watching her hands move through the dirt. "Sarah planted those," he said, 3 years ago, the spring before she died. Temperance's hands stilled. She did not look at him, sensed somehow that he needed her not to look. "She was my wife." The words came slowly, as if he were pulling them up from somewhere deep. "Fever took her. 2 winters past." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." His voice was rough. "Being sorry doesn't change anything. Doesn't bring anyone back." She thought of her own losses, the parents she'd never known, the friends who'd aged out of the orphanage and scattered to the winds, the small hopes she'd buried one by one over the years. "No," she agreed quietly. "It doesn't." He stood there a moment longer. Then he turned and walked away, his shoulders set in that rigid line she was beginning to recognize as his armor against the world. But he had told her. That was something. That night she heard him cry out again, "Sarah, Sarah!" And she lay in the darkness of the barn loft, her heart aching for a man she barely knew, grieving a woman she would never meet. The second week brought rain. 3 days of it, steady and cold, turning the yard to mud and keeping them both confined to their separate shelters. Temperance used the time to finish the mending, then started on the pile of fabric scraps she'd found in the sewing kit, cutting them into squares, piecing them together into the beginnings of a quilt she had no right to make. It was women's work. The kind of work that said, "I am staying. I am making a home here." She told herself she was only passing the time, but her hands knew the truth, even if her mind refused to speak it. On the third evening, the rain finally stopped. She emerged from the barn to find Silas standing in the yard, staring at the road that led to town. "Rider comin'," he said without turning around. Temperance followed his gaze and saw the distant figure on horseback, still a quarter-mile out but approaching steadily. Her stomach tightened. In her experience, unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. They stood together, not close, but closer than they'd been since she arrived, and waited. The rider was a woman. Temperance saw that first, the shape of a skirt against the horse's flank. Then, as she drew nearer, the details emerged. Gray hair beneath a practical bonnet, a face lined with age and weather, and something that might have been kindness or might have been calculation. "Silas Crenshaw," the woman called out as she reined her horse to a stop. "I heard you had company." Silas's jaw tightened.
News travels fast.
"It does when there's nothing else to talk about." The woman's eyes moved to Temperance, sharp and assessing. "You must be the mail-order bride, the one Caleb sent for." Temperance felt her cheeks flush. "I'm Temperance Holloway." "I know who you are, child. Whole town knows." The woman swung down from her horse with surprising agility for her age. "I'm Ida Perkins. My husband's the preacher in Bitter Creek." She paused, her gaze moving between Temperance and Silas with obvious interest. "I came to see how you're getting on." "She's fine," Silas said flatly. "She's staying in the barn." "The barn?" Ida's eyebrows rose. "For 2 weeks?" "She has shelter, food, privacy." His voice had gone hard. "What business is it of yours?" "None at all, I suppose. Except that people are talking, Silas. A young woman living on a man's property, no chaperone, no marriage." She shook her head. "You know how it looks." "I know how it is, and that's all that matters." Ida turned to Temperance, her expression softening slightly. "Is he treating you well, child?"
Truly?
Temperance glanced at Silas, at the rigid set of his shoulders, the muscle jumping in his jaw, and felt something shift in her chest. Something that might have been loyalty, though she had no right to feel it. "He's been nothing but decent," she said firmly. "More than decent. He had no obligation to help me, and he did anyway." Ida studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Good. That's good." She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I brought bread and some preserves. Figured you could use them." She pressed the bundle into Temperance's hands before either of them could refuse. Then she mounted her horse again, gathering the reins with practiced ease. "The offer stands," she said, looking at Silas. "If you want to make this proper, my husband can perform the ceremony. No cost, no fuss." She paused. "Think about it." She rode away without waiting for an answer. Silas stood motionless until she disappeared over the ridge. Then he turned and walked toward the cabin, his boots squelching in the mud. "Silas!" Temperance called after him. He stopped, but didn't turn around. "I won't," she swallowed hard. "I won't let them pressure you into anything. I'll find another way. I'll leave if I have to."
Slowly he turned. His face was unreadable in the fading light, but something in his eyes, something raw and uncertain, made her breath catch. "I don't want you to leave," he said quietly. Then he went inside and closed the door behind him, leaving her standing alone in the muddy yard, her heart pounding against her ribs. That night she found a box. She hadn't meant to snoop. She'd only been looking for more fabric scraps, more thread, something to keep her hands busy while her mind raced in circles. But the box was there, tucked beneath the workbench in the corner of the barn, a wooden box about the size of a bread loaf with a broken latch that hung open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in the same hand she recognized from the 3 she'd received in Cincinnati. Caleb's hand. But these weren't addressed to her. They were addressed to other women, women in Boston and Philadelphia and St. Louis, women with names like Mary and Eleanor and Catherine, women who had written back.
Temperance sank onto the barn floor, the letters spilling across her lap, and realized with dawning horror that she was not the first woman Caleb Crenshaw had lured to this place with false promises. She was only the first one who had actually arrived. The letters lay scattered across her lap like fallen leaves, each one a testament to deception. Temperance's hands trembled as she lifted the first envelope, addressed to a Miss Mary Thornton of Boston, Massachusetts, and withdrew the folded pages within. "My dearest Mary," the letter began, "I hope this finds you in good health and spirits. The spring has finally come to our valley, and with it my thoughts turn ever more frequently to you." The words blurred before her eyes. She recognized the cadence, the careful flourishes, the way Caleb had of making ordinary observations sound like poetry. He had written to her of spring as well, of how the wildflowers painted the meadows in colors that reminded him of the ribbons she'd described wearing in her hair. She had thought those words were meant for her alone. Temperance set Mary Thornton's letter aside and reached for another. This one was addressed to Eleanor Price of Philadelphia, dated nearly 8 months ago. The paper was heavier, more expensive than what Caleb had used for her correspondence. "My darling Eleanor," he had written, "your last letter brought such joy to my solitary existence. You ask what my cabin looks like, and I find myself wishing I possessed the artist's skill to capture it properly for you." He had described the same cabin, the same mountain view, the same creek that sang over the rocks in springtime. He had painted the same picture for Eleanor Price that he had painted for Temperance Holloway, using nearly identical words. She counted the letters, 43 in total, representing correspondence with at least 12 different women across 7 states. Some exchanges had ended after only a letter or two. Perhaps the women had grown suspicious or found other prospects, or simply lost interest in a stranger's promises. But others had continued for months, the letters growing progressively more intimate, more urgent, more laden with talk of marriage and homesteads and the life they would build together. Catherine Wells of St. Louis had sent Caleb a lock of her hair, which Temperance found pressed between the pages of his final letter to her. The hair was dark and glossy, tied with a scrap of blue ribbon. Temperance wondered if Catherine had waited at a stagecoach station somewhere, scanning the faces of strangers, searching for a man who would never come to claim her. Or perhaps Catherine had been wiser than Temperance. Perhaps she had recognized the falseness in Caleb's words and stayed safely in St. Louis, nursing nothing worse than disappointment. The barn door creaked. Temperance looked up to find Silas standing in the entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. He held a pail of milk in one hand and a lantern in the other, though the sun had not yet set. His eyes found the letters immediately, the scattered envelopes, the opened pages, the damning evidence of his brother's betrayal spread across the barn floor like a confession. Neither of them spoke. Silas set down the pail and the lantern with careful deliberation.
He crossed to where Temperance sat amid the paper wreckage and lowered himself onto an overturned crate, his movements slow and heavy, as though the weight of the letters pressed down upon him as well. "Where did you find those?" His voice was rough, stripped of its usual guardedness. "Beneath the floorboards." Temperance gestured toward the loose plank. "I wasn't searching for secrets. I dropped my needle, and when I went to retrieve it—" "I know." Silas ran a hand over his face. "I know you weren't looking. Caleb hid things. It's what he did. I've been finding his secrets for months now. Gambling debts, unpaid bills, promises he made to half the merchants in town." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I didn't know about the women." Temperance looked down at the letter still clutched in her fingers. Eleanor Price's letter, with its talk of wedding gowns and china patterns and the children they would raise together in the mountain air. "There are 12 of them," she said quietly. 12 women he wrote to. Perhaps more. These are only the letters he kept. Why would he keep them? It was a question Temperance had been asking herself since she discovered the cache. Why save evidence of such calculated cruelty? Why preserve the responses of women he had no intention of honoring? "I think," she said slowly, "he enjoyed it. The power of it, making women believe in something that didn't exist." She met Silas's eyes. He kept their letters like trophies. Silas made a sound low in his throat, not quite a word, but something that conveyed disgust and grief and a terrible, weary resignation. He reached for one of the letters, and Temperance watched him read it, watched his expression shift from confusion to comprehension to something darker. "This one's dated last October," he said. "He was still living here then, eating my food, sleeping under my roof." He crumpled the letter in his fist, and all the while he was doing this. "Did you know?" The question escaped before Temperance could stop it. "About the kind of man he was?" Silas was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge, leaving only exhaustion behind. "I knew he was weak. I knew he couldn't be trusted with money or responsibility or anything that required him to think beyond his own comfort." He unclenched his fist and stared at the ruined letter. "But I believed that there was still something decent in him. Something that might grow into a better man if given time and patience and enough second chances." "How many chances did you give him?" "Too many." Silas dropped the crumpled paper. "Our mother died when Caleb was 12. Our father followed her 3 years later. I was 22, and suddenly I was responsible for a boy who had never learned to be responsible for himself. I thought I could teach him. I thought if I worked hard enough, provided enough, showed him what a good life could look like." He broke off, shaking his head. "I was a fool." Temperance gathered the scattered letters into a pile, handling them with a strange tenderness despite what they represented. Each one was a story of hope betrayed, of trust misplaced, of women who had dared to believe that a stranger's words might lead to something real. "The women in these letters," she said, "do you think any of them actually came? Before me?" Silas's expression shifted. "I don't know. I was gone for most of last year, drove cattle up to Montana, didn't return until November. Caleb was supposed to tend the homestead while I was away.
A bitter laugh escaped him. When I got back, half the livestock was sold, the barn roof was leaking, and he'd run up debts in every establishment from here to the county seat. He left 2 weeks later, in the middle of the night, without a word of explanation or apology. And the letters he wrote me, the ones promising marriage, those came after he left? Must have. He posted them from wherever he was running to. Silas met her eyes. He used my name, my address. He knew you'd come here looking for a husband, and he knew I'd be the one left to deal with the consequences. The cruelty of it stole Temperance's breath. Caleb hadn't simply deceived her. He had weaponized her against his own brother. He had sent her to this place knowing she would arrive expecting a life that didn't exist, knowing Silas would be forced to either take responsibility for his brother's lies or turn away a woman with nowhere else to go. "Why would he do that?" she whispered. "What did he gain from sending me here?" Silas was quiet for so long that Temperance thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. Spite, maybe.
Or habit. Caleb never could resist the chance to make someone else clean up his messes. He paused. Or maybe he thought you'd actually convince me to marry you. Maybe he thought he was doing me a favor in his own twisted way. I've been alone since Sarah died. Caleb always said it wasn't natural, a man living by himself in the mountains. Maybe he thought. He stopped abruptly as though he'd revealed more than he intended. "Sarah," Temperance said softly. "The woman who wore the gardening gloves." Silas's face went rigid. "Yes." She waited, but he offered nothing more. The silence stretched between them, filled with the rustle of paper and the distant lowing of cattle and all the questions neither of them was ready to ask. Finally, Temperance rose to her feet, gathering the letters into the box from which they'd come. "What should I do with these?" "Burn them." "And the women who wrote them? Don't they deserve to know what Caleb did? What he might still be doing to others?" Silas looked at her, really looked at her, and Temperance saw something shift in his expression. It was not warmth exactly, but it was no longer the cold distance he had maintained since her arrival. It was recognition, acknowledgement, the understanding that she was not merely a problem to be solved, but a person who had been wronged just as surely as he had been wronged. "You ought to warn them," he said. "I want to give them the truth, the choice I never had." He nodded slowly. "Then keep the letters. Write to them if you want. Tell them whatever you think they need to hear." He rose from the crate, his height casting a long shadow across the barn floor. "But Temperance," it was the first time he had used her name, "don't expect it to change anything. People believe what they want to believe. Some of those women probably already know Caleb was lying, and they've moved on with their lives. Others will refuse to accept it, no matter what proof you offer." His voice softened just slightly. "And some of them might be grateful. But you won't know which is which until you try." He turned toward the barn door, then paused. "Supper's in an hour. You should eat inside tonight. It's going to rain." He left without waiting for her response. Temperance stood alone in the barn, clutching the box of letters to her chest. The afternoon light was fading, and the first distant rumble of thunder confirmed Silas's prediction. She thought about the women whose words she held, Mary and Eleanor and Catherine and all the others, and she thought about the man who had deceived them all, but mostly she thought about Silas.
about the brother who had been left to carry the weight of another man's sins, about the wife named Sarah who had worn these gloves and walked these floors and died in a way that still haunted him, about the walls he had built around himself and the tiny crack that had appeared in them tonight when he spoke her name. She was still standing there, lost in thought, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the homestead. Not one horse, several, and voices, rough, male voices, calling out for Silas Crenshaw. Temperance set down the box and moved to the barn door, peering through the gap between the weathered boards. 3 men on horseback had reined in before the cabin, their faces hard and their postures aggressive. The one in front, a heavy-set man with a beard the color of rust, was already dismounting. "Crenshaw," he bellowed, "you and I need to have words about your brother's debts.
And this time, I ain't leaving without payment."
The rust-bearded man's voice cut through the morning air like a blade through butter, and Temperance pressed herself against the barn door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the gap in the boards, she watched Silas emerge from behind the cabin, an axe still in his hand from splitting wood. "Granger," Silas's voice carried no fear, only a weary recognition. "You're on my land. Your brother's debts make it my business what land I stand on." Granger took a step forward, his 2 companions remaining mounted, their hands resting on their thighs in a way that suggested easy access to the pistols at their hips. $300, Crenshaw. That's what Caleb owes me from the card tables in Helena, plus interest. Caleb's debts are Caleb's concern. He's not here. Then they become your concern." Granger smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Blood pays for blood. That's how it works out here." Temperance's fingers curled around the edge of the barn door. She could feel the tension radiating across the yard like heat from a forge.
Silas stood perfectly still, the axe held loosely at his side, not threatening, but not abandoned either.
"I've got no $300, Silas said flatly, "and even if I did, I wouldn't pay my brother's gambling debts. You extended him credit, that was your mistake." Granger's smile faded. "Maybe I'll take it out in property then. That mare in the paddock looks healthy. The cabin's got good timber. Or maybe," his eyes drifted toward the barn, and Temperance felt her blood turn to ice, "maybe I'll take a look at what else you've got hidden away." "You'll leave now," Silas's voice had dropped to something quiet and dangerous, "while you still can." One of the mounted men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "There's 3 of us, Crenshaw, and 1 of you." "I can count." Silas shifted his weight slightly, and Temperance saw something change in his posture, a coiling readiness that spoke of a man who had faced violence before and hadn't flinched from it. "Question is whether you can count the cost of what happens if you don't ride out of here in the next 30 seconds. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut.
Temperance held her breath, watching Granger's face cycle through calculation, anger, and finally, reluctantly, something like caution. Whatever he saw in Silas's eyes made him take a half step backward. "This isn't over," Granger said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "I'll be back, and next time I won't be so patient." He mounted his horse with less grace than his arrival had suggested, and the 3 men wheeled their animals toward the road. Temperance didn't move until the sound of hoofbeats had faded entirely into the distance. When she finally emerged from the barn, Silas was still standing in the same spot, staring at the empty road. He didn't turn when she approached. "How much does he owe?" Temperance asked quietly. In total, all of them. More than this land is worth. Silas's jaw tightened. More than I can pay in 5 years of honest work. And they'll keep coming. It wasn't a question. Silas finally turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw something crack in that granite exterior. Not weakness, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a weight he never agreed to bear. They'll keep coming, he confirmed.
The storm arrived 3 days later, without warning and without mercy. Temperance had noticed the sky changing throughout the morning, that peculiar greenish gray that spoke of weather turning mean, but she hadn't expected the violence of what followed. By noon, the wind had risen to a howl that shook the barn's timbers. By evening, the snow was falling so thick and fast that she couldn't see the cabin from the barn door. Silas appeared through the white curtain like a ghost, his coat already caked with ice, and grabbed her arm without ceremony. "Inside!" he shouted over the wind. "Now! The barn won't hold!" She didn't argue. They fought their way through the blizzard together, the 30 yards between the barn and the cabin feeling like 30 miles. When they finally stumbled through the cabin door, Temperance's fingers were numb and her lungs burned from the cold. Silas slammed the door shut behind them, and suddenly the world contracted to this single room, the crackling fire, the rough-hewn walls, the two of them standing closer together than they had been since the day she arrived. "The animals," she gasped. "Fed and watered this morning."
They'll survive. He was already moving toward the fire, adding logs with practiced efficiency. We need to worry about ourselves. The storm raged for 6 days. On the first day, they maintained their careful distance, Silas taking the chair by the fire, Temperance the narrow cot against the far wall that she realized must have been where he'd been sleeping since giving her the barn. They spoke only when necessary, the howling wind filling the silences between them. On the second day, the silence became unbearable. "Who was Sarah?" The question escaped Temperance before she could stop it. She had been watching Silas repair a harness by firelight, his hands moving with that same careful precision she had observed in everything he did, and the name had simply risen to her lips like a bubble breaking the surface of still water. His hands went still. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "My wife." The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the wind's keening. Temperance felt something shift in her chest, not surprise exactly, but a settling of pieces she had already suspected into their proper places. "The garden," she said softly. "The gloves."
The herbs. All hers. Silas set down the harness, staring into the fire. "She died 3 winters ago. Fever took her fast. 3 days from the first cough to the last breath. I buried her beneath the oak tree on the ridge. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry." His voice held no bitterness, only a bone-deep weariness. "Sorry doesn't bring her back. Sorry doesn't fill the silence." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rougher. "She would have liked you, I think. Sarah always said I was too stubborn for my own good. She would have laughed to see me now, trapped in my own cabin with a woman I never sent for." It was the most he had ever said to her at once. Temperance felt the weight of it, the trust implicit in those words, and chose her next ones carefully. What was she like? And slowly, haltingly, Silas began to tell her. He spoke of Sarah through the second day and into the third, of how they had met at a church social in Missouri, how she had laughed at his clumsy attempts at dancing, How she had agreed to marry him after a courtship of only 6 weeks because, she said, she had known from the first moment that he was the kind of man who would never lie to her.
She was wrong about that, Silas said quietly on the 4th day as the wind continued its relentless assault. I lied to her every day. Every time she asked if I was happy, I said yes. Every time she asked if I minded that we couldn't have children, I said it didn't matter. They weren't big lies, but they were lies. Why? Because I loved her. And loving someone means protecting them from the things that would hurt them, even if those things are the truth. Temperance considered this. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. Inside, something was shifting between them, walls coming down, not with dramatic collapse, but with the slow erosion of water against stone. "The letters Caleb wrote to me," she said, "they were beautiful lies. Promises of a life that didn't exist, a man who didn't exist. I wanted to believe them so badly that I ignored every warning sign." She pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I was a fool." "You were hopeful." Silas's voice was gruff. "There's a difference." On the 5th day, he taught her to play cards, not the gambling games his brother had favored, but simple games of strategy and luck that passed the hours. She won more often than she lost, and each victory drew something closer to a smile from him. On the 6th day, the wind finally died. They stood together at the window watching the snow settle into stillness, and Temperance became aware of how close they were standing, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to see the individual threads of gray at his temples. "The storm's over," she said, though it was obvious. "Yes." Neither of them moved. "Silas?" She turned to face him and found him already looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "These past days—" "I know." His voice was rough. "I know." He reached out, and for one breathless moment, she thought he was going to touch her face. But his hand stopped just short, hovering in the space between them like a question he wasn't ready to ask. "The snow will melt," he said quietly. "And when it does, people will talk. About you being here. About us." "Let them talk." "You don't understand." He dropped his hand and she saw something like pain flash across his features. In a town like Bitter Creek, talk becomes truth. And once they decide what the truth is, there's no escaping it. Before she could respond, there was a sound from outside, the crunch of footsteps through snow, the whinny of a horse. Someone was coming. Silas moved to the window, his body going rigid. When he turned back to her, his face had closed off again, all the openness of the past 6 days retreating behind that familiar granite wall. "It's Harriet," he said flatly. "My brother's sister. The one who—" He didn't need to finish. Temperance understood. "The one who wrote the letters." A sharp knock sounded at the door, and a woman's voice, brisk, commanding, entirely unapologetic, called out, "Silas Crenshaw, I know you're in there, and I know she's with you. Open this door right now. We need to talk about what happens next." The door shuddered under Harriet's second knock, more insistent than the first. Temperance stood frozen by the hearth, acutely aware of how this must look, her hair loose around her shoulders, Silas's spare shirt hanging past her hips because her own clothes had been soaked through on the 2nd day of the storm. The intimacy of the cabin pressed against her like an accusation. 2 cups on the table, the quilts still tangled on the floor where they'd slept on opposite sides of the fire, the easy domesticity that had grown between them during 6 days of isolation, all of it damning,
none of it what it appeared. Silas crossed to the door with heavy steps, his jaw set in that familiar hard line. He didn't look back at her before he lifted the latch. Harriet Crenshaw swept into the cabin like weather itself, a small woman with iron-gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her features, her black wool coat still dusted with the last of the melting snow. Behind her stood a taller woman, younger, with kind eyes and a nervous mouth. The preacher's wife, Temperance guessed, though she'd never met her. 6 days, Harriet said without preamble, her gaze sweeping the cabin's interior with the precision of a surveyor marking property lines. 6 days, Silas. Do you have any idea what they're saying in town? I imagine you're about to tell me. Don't take that tone. Harriet's attention snapped to Temperance, cataloging every detail, the borrowed shirt, the bare feet, the flush creeping up her neck. Miss Holloway, I see you've made yourself comfortable. The words carried edges sharp enough to draw blood. Mrs. Crenshaw, Temperance lifted her chin, refusing to shrink. The storm. I'm aware of the storm. I lived through it, same as everyone else. Harriet pulled off her gloves, finger by finger, with deliberate slowness. What I'm trying to understand is why you didn't shelter in the barn, as I was told was the arrangement. The barn roof collapsed. Silas moved to stand beside Temperance, not touching her, but close enough that his presence felt like a shield. Second night, would you have preferred I let her freeze? Something flickered across Harriet's face. Not quite guilt, but perhaps its distant cousin. Of course not. But surely you understand the position this puts everyone in. Martha here, she gestured to the woman still hovering near the doorway, came to me yesterday with concerns.
The whole town is talking.
Martha Croft stepped forward, wringing her hands. I'm sorry to intrude, truly. My husband, Reverend Croft, he thought perhaps if I spoke with Miss Holloway directly, we might find a solution that satisfies propriety. Propriety. The word tasted bitter on Temperance's tongue. I came here expecting a husband, Mrs. Croft. I was deceived by letters I now know were written to a dozen other women. I have no money to leave, no family to return to, and nowhere else to go. If the town's primary concern is propriety, perhaps they might direct their outrage toward the man who created this situation rather than the woman trapped by it. Silence fell like a hammer. Martha's eyes went wide. Even Harriet seemed momentarily stunned, her mouth opening and closing without sound. It was Silas who broke the tension, a rough sound escaping his throat that might have been a laugh. She's not wrong. Caleb's sins are his own, Harriet said stiffly. But we must deal with the consequences as they stand. The fact remains that an unmarried woman has been living on your property for weeks now, Silas. After 6 days alone together in this cabin, nothing happened. It doesn't matter what happened. It matters what people believe happened. Harriet's voice softened slightly, and for the first time Temperance glimpsed something other than judgment in her expression. Weariness, perhaps. The bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had spent too many years cleaning up after her brother's messes. I'm not your enemy, Miss Holloway. I'm trying to help you. Help me how? Martha stepped forward again, her nervousness giving way to earnest concern. My husband and I discussed it. We have a spare room, small but private. You could stay with us, help with the household, perhaps take in mending from the townswomen. It would give you time to decide what comes next, and it would quiet the talk. The offer hung in the air between them, reasonable, practical, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Temperance should have grasped it immediately. Instead, she found herself looking at Silas. His face had gone carefully blank, that granite wall fully restored. But something in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before the storm, made her hesitate. He stood with his arms crossed, his shoulders rigid, every line of his body radiating the same message he'd given her that first day. I just want to be left alone. But she'd seen him during those 6 days. She'd watched him laugh at her terrible attempts to make coffee. She'd listened to him talk about Sarah in the darkness, his voice cracking on her name. She'd felt the brush of his fingers against hers when he handed her a cup, a touch that lasted half a heartbeat longer than necessary. He wanted to be left alone, but wanting and needing were different things entirely. "That's very generous," Temperance said slowly. "Might I have some time to consider?" Harriet's lips thinned. "Time is precisely what you don't have. Every day you remain here, a few days." Martha interrupted gently. "Surely a few days won't matter, Harriet. The girl's been through an ordeal." She turned to Temperance with a warm smile. "Take the time you need, Miss Holloway. My husband always says that hasty decisions made under pressure rarely serve us well. Come to the parsonage when you're ready. The offer will stand." She touched Harriet's arm, a subtle signal. The older woman's jaw tightened, but she nodded curtly. 3 days, Harriet said. After that, I wash my hands of the whole affair. She paused at the door, looking back at Silas with an expression Temperance couldn't quite read. I know you blame me for the letters, for not telling you sooner what Caleb was doing. But I didn't know the extent of it, Silas. I swear to you I didn't know. Would it have mattered if you did? The question landed like a blow. Harriet flinched, then straightened her spine and walked out into the muddy yard without another word. Martha lingered a moment longer, her kind eyes moving between Silas and Temperance with something like hope. Reverend Croft will be praying for you both, she said softly. Whatever you decide. Then she was gone, and the cabin felt suddenly vast in its emptiness. Temperance let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her legs felt weak, and she sank onto the bench by the table, pressing her palms flat against the rough wood to steady herself. You should take it. She looked up. Silas stood by the window, watching the two women make their way down the muddy track toward town. His voice was flat, emotionless, but his hands were clenched at his sides. The offer, he continued. The parsonage, it's a good solution. Is that what you want? He turned to face her, and for a moment, just a moment, the wall cracked. She saw exhaustion there, and something else, something that looked almost like fear. What I want doesn't matter. It never has. He crossed to the hearth, crouching to add another log to the dying fire. The flames caught, casting dancing shadows across his features. The preacher and his wife are good people. They'll treat you fairly. You can build a life there, find proper work, maybe even what? Find another husband? The bitterness surprised her. Start fresh with someone who actually wants me? Silas flinched. That's not what Then what? She stood, her borrowed shirt swirling around her thighs. Tell me what you mean, Silas. For once, just say what you're actually thinking, instead of hiding behind duty and practicality and all these walls you've built. The fire crackled between them. Outside, water dripped steadily from the eaves as the last of the snow surrendered to the warming sun. I'm thinking, Silas said slowly, each word dragged from somewhere deep, that you deserve better than a broken man in a cabin full of ghosts. I'm thinking that every moment you stay here, I make it harder for you to leave. And I'm thinking that if you don't go now—" He stopped, his throat working. "If I don't go now, what?" He looked at her then, really looked, and the rawness in his gaze stole her breath. "If you don't go now, I might ask you to stay. And that wouldn't be fair to either of us." Temperance's heart hammered against her ribs. The 6 days of the storm had changed something between them. She'd known it even as it was happening, felt the shift like tectonic plates moving beneath her feet. But hearing him acknowledge it, hearing the fear in his voice, "What if I want you to ask?" The words escaped before she could stop them. They hung in the air, fragile as spun glass, and she watched Silas's face cycle through emotions too quickly to name. Hope, terror, longing, and underneath it all the grief that never quite left his eyes. "Temperance!" A sound from outside cut him off. Hoofbeats approaching fast, multiple horses. Silas was at the window in an instant, his body going rigid. When he turned back to her, all the vulnerability had vanished, replaced by something cold and dangerous. "Get in the back room," he said quietly. "Now." "What is it? Who?" "Granger." The name came out like a curse. He brought more men this time. Through the window, Temperance could see them. 5 riders emerging from the tree line, the lead figure unmistakable even at this distance. Granger sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who expected to get what he came for. And this time, he hadn't come alone. The riders came down the slope like wolves descending on wounded prey. Temperance didn't retreat to the back room. Instead, she moved to the far wall where Silas kept his rifle mounted, her fingers finding the cold metal before her mind fully registered what she was doing. 3 weeks ago, she wouldn't have known how to load it. Now her hands moved with the practiced efficiency Silas had taught her during the long, storm-bound days, when he'd insisted she learn to shoot in case the wolves got bold. She understood now that he'd never been talking about wolves. "I told you to get in the back," Silas said without turning from the window. "And I told you I don't take orders from men I'm not married to." A sound escaped him, something that might have been a laugh in different circumstances. He didn't argue further, just reached for the shotgun hanging by the door. Through the frost-rimmed glass, Temperance watched Granger and his men halt their horses 30 yards from the cabin. 5 of them now, and she recognized the 2 from before. The thin one with the nervous hands and the broad-shouldered man who'd spat tobacco at her feet. The 3 newcomers looked harder, meaner, the kind of men who did violence for wages and slept soundly afterward. "Crenshaw!" Granger's voice carried across the clearing, jovial and threatening in equal measure. "I told you I'd be back. Brought some friends to help with the negotiations." Silas opened the door just wide enough to show himself, the shotgun held casually but visible. "Nothing to negotiate. I don't owe you anything, and my brother's not here to pay what he does." "See, that's where you're wrong." Granger dismounted, his boots crunching in the remnants of snow that still clung to the shadowed ground. "Way I figure it, this land, this cabin, it's all built on Crenshaw money. Your daddy's money, your brother's share. Caleb signed over his half to me 3 months ago. Witnessed and legal." Temperance watched Silas's shoulders stiffen almost imperceptibly. This was new information. She could see it in the way his grip shifted on the shotgun. "You're lying." "Am I?" Granger reached into his coat, and 2 of his men drew their pistols in response to Silas's sudden movement. Easy now. Just paper. He held up a folded document, waving it like a flag of surrender. Got his signature right here. Half this property belongs to me, which means I got every right to be here. Every right to collect what's mine. Get off my land. Our land. Granger's smile widened. But I'm a reasonable man. You pay me $300. Call it a buyout of Caleb's share, and I'll sign it back over to you. Otherwise, I start taking inventory of what belongs to me. His eyes drifted past Silas to where Temperance stood in the shadows of the cabin. Starting with whatever your brother left behind. The shotgun came up.
You take one more step toward this cabin, and I'll scatter you across the yard. You'll get one shot, Granger said calmly. Maybe two. My boys will get the rest. He spread his hands, the gesture almost friendly. Nobody needs to die here, Crenshaw. I don't want your land, too far from town, too much work. I want money. Money your brother stole from me with his crooked cards and his pretty lies. Now, I can take it out of your hide, or I can take it out of your property. Your choice. The silence stretched between them, thin and brittle as spring ice. Then Temperance stepped forward, moving past Silas before he could stop her. She felt his hand grab for her arm and miss, heard his sharp intake of breath. But she was already standing in the doorway, the rifle held across her body like a barrier. "How much did Caleb take from you?" she asked. "Total. Not what you claim he owes, what he actually stole." Granger's eyebrows rose. "Well now, the mail-order bride speaks." He looked her over with an appraising gaze that made her skin crawl. "Caleb always did have good taste in, answer the question." Something in her voice made him pause. Perhaps it was the steadiness of her hands on the rifle, or the flat calm in her eyes, the same calm she'd learned to wear when creditors came to her boarding house in Cincinnati, when men twice her size tried to intimidate her into giving up what little she had. $212, Granger said finally, give or take. Not 300. Interest. He shrugged. Man's got to make a living. And that paper, the one supposedly signing over half this property, how much did you pay Caleb for it? Granger's smile flickered. That's not, because if he sold you his half for anything less than its value, and you're now demanding $300 on top of that, you're not collecting a debt. You're running an extortion scheme. Temperance tilted her hand. The territorial marshal might find that interesting. So might the land office in Helena when they learn you're trying to claim property through fraudulent means. Fraudulent? Granger's face darkened. I've got a signed, you've got a piece of paper that a known liar and cheat gave you. A man who's fled the territory and can't verify his own signature. A man who wrote love letters to a dozen women using the same pretty words. She smiled thinly. I found those letters. I wonder what else I might find if I went looking. Caleb wasn't careful about hiding his schemes. Maybe there's something in that box of papers that shows exactly how he cheated you at cards, something that might make you look like a fool in front of every man from here to Helena. Granger's hand dropped to his pistol. One of his men moved forward. You shoot us, Temperance continued, her voice never wavering, and you'll have nothing. No money, no property, no proof of anything except murder. The preacher's wife knows I'm here. She's expecting me in town this afternoon. When I don't arrive, they'll come looking. They'll find our bodies, and they'll find you. The clearing went silent. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. "You've got nerve," Granger said finally. "I'll give you that." "I've got nothing left to lose. There's a difference." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Granger laughed, a short, harsh sound that held no humor. $200. Cash. "You have 1 week to find it, or I come back with the sheriff and that paper, and we'll see what the law has to say about property rights." He swung back onto his horse, gathering the reins. 1 week, Crenshaw. Don't make me come back here again." They rode out the way they'd come, disappearing into the tree line like shadows retreating from dawn. Temperance didn't lower the rifle until the sound of hoofbeats faded entirely. Then her hands began to shake. Silas pulled her back inside, taking the rifle from her trembling fingers and setting it aside. His face was unreadable, but his hands were gentle as he guided her to a chair. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said quietly, "or the most foolish." "Both, probably." She pressed her palms flat against her thighs, willing the tremors to stop. "I couldn't let him. I couldn't just stand there and watch him threaten you." "You should have stayed in the back room." "And let you face 5 armed men alone?" "I've faced worse." "I don't doubt it." She looked up at him, really looked, and saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Fear, yes, but not for himself. Fear for her. "But you shouldn't have to face anything alone. Not anymore." Silas turned away, moving to the window to stare out at the empty clearing. The morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair, the tension in his shoulders, the weariness that seemed to have settled into his bones. "I don't have $200, he said. "I don't have 50. Everything I had went into the seed for spring planting, and that's still sitting in the barn waiting for the ground to thaw. We'll find a way." "There is no we, Temperance." The words came out rough, almost angry. "You're leaving. Going to stay with the preacher's wife, remember? Getting away from here, away from this mess my brother made. Away from—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "Away from you?" He didn't answer. Temperance stood slowly, crossing the small space between them. She could see his reflection in the glass, the way his eyes closed when she drew near, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Martha Croft offered me a room," she said softly. "A chance to start over, to build something respectable. A few months of work, and I could save enough for a ticket somewhere else. Somewhere no one knows about the letters, or Caleb, or any of this. That's what you should do. Is it what you want me to do?" The question hung between them, heavy with everything they hadn't said during those 6 storm-bound days. Heavy with shared meals and quiet conversations, with the brush of fingers passing a cup of coffee, with the way he'd looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. "What I want doesn't matter," Silas said. "It matters to me." He turned then, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes. Duty against desire, protection against need. The ghost of a woman named Sarah against the living, breathing woman standing before him. "I can't give you what Caleb promised," he said. "I'm not that man. I don't have pretty words or easy smiles. I've got a cabin that's falling apart, land I can barely work alone, and debts that aren't even mine. I've got a dead wife I couldn't save, and a brother I couldn't control, and nothing to offer a woman like you. Silas, you deserve better. I deserve to make my own choices." She reached up,
her fingers brushing the rough stubble of his jaw. He flinched but didn't pull away.
I came here expecting a stranger who wrote beautiful letters. I found a different stranger, one who doesn't write letters at all, who barely speaks, who's been hurt so badly he's forgotten how to let anyone close. Her thumb traced the line of his cheekbone. But I've also found a man who gave up his bed so I could sleep in his barn, who taught me to shoot so I could protect myself, who sat with me through a storm and told me about the woman he lost, not because he wanted my pity, but because he trusted me with his grief. Temperance, I'm not asking you to be Caleb. I'm not asking you to make promises you can't keep. I'm asking you to let me stay. Let me help you fight this. Let me— She drew a shaky breath. Let me choose this. Choose you. For a long moment he simply stared at her, his expression caught somewhere between wonder and anguish. Then, slowly, his hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his face. If you stay, he said roughly, people will talk. They'll assume things. Your reputation— My reputation was ruined the moment I stepped off that stagecoach. I can't marry you just to save face. I won't do that to you, trap you in a marriage built on obligation. Then don't marry me for obligation. She held his gaze, willing him to understand. Marry me because you want to. Or don't marry me at all, and I'll stay anyway, and damn what anyone thinks. The sound he made was almost a laugh, broken and breathless. You're impossible. I've been told. His forehead dropped to rest against hers, his breath warm on her lips. I don't know how to do this, he whispered. I don't know how to let someone in again, after Sarah. I know. I might fail you. You might. I might fail you too. She smiled despite the tears threatening to fall. But I'd rather fail together than succeed alone. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like she'd imagined. It wasn't the passionate embrace from the dime novels, or the chaste press of lips she'd expected from a man so guarded. It was something else entirely, tentative and desperate and achingly tender, like a man dying of thirst finally allowing himself to drink. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Silas kept his hands framed around her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. Tomorrow, he said. We'll go to town tomorrow, talk to the preacher. You don't have to. I want to. The words seemed to cost him something, but his eyes were clear when he said them. I want to, Temperance. God help me, I want to. She opened her mouth to respond, but a sound from outside made them both freeze. The crack of a branch, too close to be natural. Silas moved instantly, pushing her behind him as he reached for the shotgun. Through the window, a figure emerged from the tree line, not Granger's men, but a woman on horseback riding hard toward the cabin. Even at this distance, Temperance could see the pale oval of her face, the dark hair streaming behind her, the desperate way she clutched the reins. And she could see the small, still bundle cradled in the woman's arms. Silas went rigid beside her, his face draining of color. That's Harriet, he breathed. That's my sister. And that's— His voice cracked. That's Caleb's daughter, the one he left behind. Harriet's horse stumbled to a halt in front of the cabin, its sides heaving with foam and exhaustion. She half fell from the saddle, clutching the bundle to her chest with a desperation that made Temperance's heart seize. She's burning up, Harriet gasped, her face streaked with tears and dust. 3 days now, The doctor in town, he said there's nothing more he can do. But I thought, Silas, maybe. Silas was already moving, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He reached for the child, and Harriet surrendered her with a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken. The baby was perhaps 8 months old, small and frighteningly still in Silas's arms. Her skin had the waxy pallor of fever, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Wisps of dark hair, Caleb's hair, Temperance realized with a jolt, clung damply to her forehead. "Inside," Temperance said, her voice cutting through the chaos with a clarity that surprised even herself. "Bring her inside. Harriet, when did she last nurse? Has she been taking water?" She didn't wait for answers, moving toward the cabin with purpose. Behind her she heard Silas's boots on the packed earth, heard Harriet's stumbling footsteps as she followed. The next hours blurred into a haze of cool cloths and willow bark tea, of coaxing tiny sips of water between cracked lips, of watching and waiting and praying to a God Temperance wasn't certain she believed in anymore. Harriet collapsed into exhausted sleep on the floor by the fire, her body finally surrendering to the 3 days she'd spent fighting alone. But Silas didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the bed where they'd laid the child, his niece, this tiny piece of his wayward brother. And he watched her breathe with the same fierce attention he'd given to the storm, to Granger's threats, to every danger that had come to his door. "Her name is Rose," he said quietly sometime after midnight. "Harriet wrote me when she was born. I never went to see her." Temperance wrung out another cloth, pressing it gently to Rose's forehead. "Why not?" "Because she was Caleb's. Because looking at her meant looking at everything he'd done, every one he'd hurt." His voice cracked like ice breaking on a spring river. "Because I'm a coward." "You're not a coward." Temperance didn't look up from the child, but she felt him watching her. "A coward would have turned me away that first day. Would have let Granger take whatever he wanted. Would have stayed silent in that storm instead of telling me about Sarah." The name hung between them, fragile as the child's breathing. "She wanted children," Silas said. "Sarah. We tried for 3 years, and then the sickness came, and I—" He stopped, his jaw working against words that wouldn't form. "I told myself I'd never want anything that much again, because wanting things means losing them." Temperance finally looked at him then. This man who had built walls of silence around his grief, who had armored himself in solitude and called it peace. She saw the fear in his eyes, not of the child's illness, but of something far more terrifying. Hope. "She's strong," Temperance said softly. "Her fever's breaking. Feel." She guided his hand to Rose's forehead, and she watched his face transform as he registered the subtle cooling of the child's skin, the easier rhythm of her breathing. Something crumbled in him then, some last defense he'd been holding against the world. "I can't do this alone," he whispered. "Any of it." The farm, the debt, this child who has no one else. His eyes found hers in the lamplight, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Bitter Creek, she saw him fully. Not the stone-faced stranger, not the reluctant host, but the man beneath, wounded and weary and reaching toward her with everything he had left. "You asked me what I wanted," he said, "that morning in the barn, when you were packing to leave." "I remember." "I didn't know how to answer you then. I'd spent so long not wanting anything that I'd forgotten what it felt like."
He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "But I know now. I want mornings where you're still there when I wake. I want to hear you singing while you work in the garden, even though you think I can't hear you. I want, Silas, I want you to stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go. Not because the town expects it, or because it's convenient or practical." He lifted her hand to his chest, pressing her palm flat against his heart. She could feel it racing beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. "I want you to stay because when I think about the rest of my life, you're the only thing in it that makes sense." Temperance closed her eyes against the sudden burning behind them. She thought of Cincinnati, of the cramped boarding house room and the endless gray days of stitching other women's wedding dresses. She thought of the letters she'd received from a man who didn't exist, promising a future that was nothing but pretty lies. And she thought of this, the truth of this moment, rough-edged and imperfect and more real than anything she'd ever known. "I came here expecting a husband," she said slowly. "A stranger who'd written beautiful words about the life we'd build together. I thought I knew what I wanted." Silas's hand tightened on hers, and she felt him bracing for rejection. "But I didn't," she continued. "I didn't know anything. Not about this place, not about you, not about myself." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I know now. I want the man who gave me his mother's sewing kit without saying a word, who taught me to shoot during a blizzard because he couldn't stand the thought of me being helpless, who stood between me and danger even when he barely knew my name. Temperance. I want the truth, Silas, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. I want to build something real with you, not some pretty dream that falls apart the moment life gets difficult." She reached up with her free hand, touching his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingertips. "I want to stay." He kissed her then, or perhaps she kissed him, it didn't matter, because they met somewhere in the middle. Two people who had learned the hard way that love wasn't about perfect words or grand promises. It was about showing up, day after day, choosing each other even when it would be easier to walk away. When they finally drew apart, Rose stirred between them, making a small sound that was more protest than distress. Silas looked down at his niece with something like wonder. "She'll need a home," he said, "a real one, with people who love her despite where she came from." "She already has one." They were married 3 weeks later, but not in the church.
The preacher came to them instead, standing in the doorway of the cabin as the morning light streamed through the windows Temperance had finally cleaned. Harriet served as witness, holding Rose on her hip while the child grabbed at the wildflowers woven into Temperance's hair. There was no white dress. Temperance wore the blue calico she'd mended twice already, the one Silas said made her eyes look like the sky after rain. There was no wedding feast, just bread and preserves and the first vegetables from the garden she'd brought back to life. But when Silas took her hands in his and spoke his vows, his voice steady and sure, Temperance understood that this was what she'd been traveling toward all along. Not the pretty lies in Caleb's letters, but this honest, imperfect, hard-won love. "I can't promise you an easy life," Silas said, his eyes never leaving hers. "This land takes more than it gives most years. The winters are long, and there will be days when we have nothing but each other." "That's enough," Temperance said.
That's more than enough. Then I promise you this. I will stand beside you through every storm. I will tell you the truth even when it's hard.
I will choose you every day for as long as I have breath in my body.
Temperance felt the tears sliding down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. And I promise you the same. I came here looking for a husband, but I found something better. I found a partner. I found a home.
The preacher pronounced them married, and Harriet cheered, and Rose laughed at the sudden noise, her small hands clapping together. Later, after the preacher had gone and Harriet had taken Rose to the newly repaired barn loft, which they'd converted into a proper room for guests, Silas and Temperance stood together on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. "Margaret Hollis stopped me in town yesterday," Silas said. "Wanted to know if you'd be willing to take on some mending work. Said half the women in Bitter Creek have been waiting for a proper seamstress." Temperance smiled, leaning into his warmth. "What did you tell her?" "Told her she'd have to ask you herself, that you make your own decisions." "Good answer." They stood in comfortable silence, the kind they'd learned during the long storm, the kind that didn't need filling. "Do you ever think about it?" Temperance asked.
What would have happened if Caleb had actually been here? If he'd been the one waiting when I stepped off that stagecoach? Silas considered the question, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "I think you would have figured him out eventually. You're too smart to be fooled forever." "Maybe." She turned to face him, this man who had become her husband, her partner, her home. "But I'm glad I didn't have to find out. I'm glad it was you." He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips, soft and sweet and full of promise. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark sang its evening song. The cabin behind them was small and weathered, the land around them wild and demanding, and the road ahead would be neither easy nor certain. But Temperance Crenshaw, no longer Holloway, no longer a stranger, no longer lost, looked at the life stretching out before her and felt, for the first time since she could remember, truly home.